Hello, and welcome to The Distillery. I'm your host, Harry Li Shanglun, and today we have special guest with us, Matthew Ventura. Hey, Matthew.
Hi, Shanglin.
How are you doing today?
Yeah, doing pretty well, thanks. Yeah, just got home from a long day of teaching, but excited to be here with you or looking at you on the screen, I guess.
Yeah. The virtual space, which everyone in this pandemic is getting very used to. What did you teach today?
I mostly spent the day teaching bassoon. I did have one flute student as well, but yeah, mostly bassoon students.
The hard-hitting questions. What do you think double reed instruments are just better?
No, but we are more employable. Um, yeah, there's far fewer bassoon players in the world than flute players, and that was part of my cunning strategy as a teenager, deciding which instrument to major in. Was there going to be more jobs in the orchestra for a bassoon player? So why not? I
I
do like the
took the
bassoon.
same.
I think I've grown to like it more that I've played it more. And of course, instrument stereotypes take their effect on you. So I've become more like a bassoon player the longer I've played it. And now flute players feel like a bit of a foreign species to me. But I think that's more nurture than nature. I don't know.
And maybe in what has got to be the most far out segue I've ever made. Speaking of nurture and nature, you describe yourself as a gay celibate Christian. Do you mind dissecting a little bit, or explaining your relationship to each of these terms of identity?
Yeah. Yeah. Firstly, I'll describe them more as descriptors than terms of identity. Identity is a complicated word, and I think lots of people use it different ways. And particularly when it comes to the way the word "gay" is understood in particularly Christian culture, identity gets really complicated. So I'll start by saying that when I describe myself as gay, I'm basically just saying I'm a guy who's attracted to guys. And the way I understand the word, it's nothing less but nothing more than that. Um, I definitely don't see it as necessarily a statement of my identity or where my significance is found or the most important thing about me, but it is saying, hey, I'm a guy who's attracted to guys. Um, Being a Christian, that's, I guess, fairly self-explanatory. I know and I love Jesus, and that's been, I guess, an important relationship to me for most of my life. In terms of the celibate part, that's the weirdest section of being gay and Christian, and I imagine there are lots of different ways of reconciling what is seen as often two very different ways of life or very different communities of people. For me, I actually do believe in a traditional Christian sexual ethic that marriage, as God designed it for Christians, is between a man and a woman, and so I'm actually mostly devoted to living my life as a single person. I've never been attracted to a woman, so I don't expect to enter a marriage as Christians define it. And I've actually made peace with that. I'm actually really excited about the Christian view of singleness and the particular picture of flourishing that gives me. It's not to say it's easy, but I think the intersection of gay and Christian means that I have actually devoted myself to celibacy.
And when you say Christian view of singleness, I mean, that's something that's kind of foreign, not just outside of Christian circles, but even maybe inside churches. So what do you mean by that?
Yeah, I think you're right. Like it is often a strange idea, even to Christians. Yeah, I think a big part of it comes from both seeing that people like Jesus were single their whole life, seeing that it doesn't make him any less human, that we're not sort of half a person waiting to find our other half, finding someone to complete us or to give our life meaning and significance. But I think as well as that, like as a Christian, I actually believe that this life isn't all there is. But when I die, that's not the finish line for me. But that actually I look forward to a life of eternity with Jesus, and not just any eternity, but a really beautiful eternity of experiencing the love and intimacy of a God who loves me. And so I think looking forward to that, like that seems to me like that's our ultimate love story. And the Bible actually speaks about that reunion as a marriage. The Bible actually talks about marriage on earth as being a temporary kind of trailer that's looking forward to this movie that we're going to have in the new creation as we're united to Jesus. And so actually, I think reframing it like that for me helps me see that marriage is important, it's good, and it's a wonderful thing that points us towards that beautiful relationship with Jesus that we'll have one day. But singleness is also perfectly adequate because it also shows us the adequacy of God in this life as we look forward to that better love story that we've got yet to come. And so a big part of that is just reframing it for me, but also seeing that being single, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 7, actually frees me up to be able to devote myself to ministry in God's community, and be able to invest really deeply in relationships with lots of different people instead of just the one person. I've been really blessed by the ministry and friendship of other single people in my life. And so I've actually started to see this value of not just tolerating singleness, but actually celebrating it as a great way of life and a way of being able to bless more people.
So it sounds like really leaning into the affordances rather than the limitations of this choice. It speaks to me of a type of authenticity which goes counter to the way that society often frames authenticity. Um, do you have any perspective on like when people say, "Oh, you should be living in one particular way," and singleness might be just like cutting off your options? Like, how would you help someone like that understand the depth and capacity for living a life as a single person?
Yeah, it's interesting that like depending on your framework or your frame of reference, you can see either way of life as cutting off options. A friend was saying recently that she finds it really weird that people often talk about married and unmarried people. And we define people are what they're not by their unmarriedness, whereas you don't define people as single people and unsingle people. When someone gets married, we don't say they become unsingle. So often, I think that reveals our frame of reference, that we see marriage as sort of this ultimate goal that life just is heading towards, and singleness is a lack of something. And honest, in a sense, that's true. But at the same time, as I was saying, as a single person, it actually opens up the doors to have much more time and emotional energy to be able to invest in a greater number of deep relationships. So in some ways, I think, yes, I'm maybe closing the door on a single, intimate sexual relationship, but opening the door on a bunch of other deep relationships. I don't see one as any ontologically better or more valuable than another. I just see them as different.
Hmm.
I see married friends who are a beautiful picture of God's love as marriage should be, and a beautiful encouragement to me. And I really celebrate their marriage. And I think actually part of why I've decided to be single, why I've decided not to pursue a relationship with a guy, is because of how much I value marriage. Because I see marriage as so important in actually being a picture of God's love for His people and being a trailer for that great reunion that's about to come in the new creation. That I don't want to mess that up by living out a marriage that doesn't look like how God designed marriage to look. And because I care about marriage so much, I actually want the integrity of abstaining from that, as God's designed, what I believe.
The picture of marriage in society has been particularly scrutinized, I think, in recent years. In Australia, we had the same-sex marriage plebiscite a few years back, and that must have been quite a tricky time for anyone. I mean, I say who identifies, but like who is attracted to people of the same gender and is also Christian. How did it feel being somebody who lived in both worlds? A term that you use, I think, is being a dual citizen, which I quite like.
Yeah, it was a really weird time. You can imagine all the complexities of, feeling caught in the crossfire, feeling sensitive to the dumb and insensitive and unloving things that people on all sides were saying. I think mostly my general vibe was I just felt emotionally depleted. Like I just didn't have the headspace to feel much more than that. It really just felt like a time of just trying to survive. I can only imagine how it must have felt to people who are actually fighting for the right to marry the person that they love. Because for me, like it doesn't affect my personal life that much either way, whether same-sex marriage is legalized. But even the rhetoric that was happening was painful enough for me. I can't even imagine how hard it would have been for others. And so I think the empathetic part of me really grieved that, seeing all my gay and lesbian and same-sex attracted friends, just really finding it tough. Working in an environment where well over 10% of my workplace would identify as queer, and just feeling this, collective grief at, just some of the unloving conversations. I remember one day I sort of came into a rehearsal, and a friend of mine had obviously not been going great, and this is 8 o'clock in the morning, and she just said she hadn't slept that much that night because she'd been caught up in some terrible discussion on Facebook with some apparently a Christian who told her that they were literally laughing about the fact that they thought she would go to hell because of her sexuality. And I just thought that was so awful. And I cried with her and gave her a big hug. And then she said to me at the end of the conversation, she said, "I wish there were other Christians like you." And that was like a real mixed feeling, because on the one hand, it's like, I'm glad that you see me as someone who you cry with and have a hug from, but it grieves me that you don't know a single other Christian that you could have this solidarity with. And I think at that point, I just realized how much I sort of grieved what the church was in that discussion, thinking, that the experience that this person had of a Christian was having someone laugh about her going to hell, and not having anyone else other than me to show solidarity with her at that time. And I think that made me really sad. I kind of want to apologize for the church and the way we might have not handled the conversations the way we should have, the way we might have failed to show love the way Jesus would. So yeah, a lot of different feelings. I think most of those are probably not unique to the plebiscite, but it really just intensified some of the rhetoric that might have happened otherwise.
I want to ask more about like the what churches can do to change that approach, that and reputation. But before that, I'm curious. I found myself code switching a lot between groups of friends, using different terminology, thinking through like what the best way to reach people is. Did you have to code switch as well across LGBT friends, Christian friends, different circles?
Oh yeah, definitely. Like terminological code switching is a big thing. So as I've sort of alluded to already today, a lot of Christians are kind of uncomfortable with Christians self-describing as gay. They prefer us to switch to the term same-sex attracted or the acronym SSA. Personally, I'm not like, I don't believe that language is fixed in its meaning. So I think that, I don't really see the big deal between one synonym and another. But I am conscious that if I want to be understood by people, if I don't want to lose their trust, sometimes I have had to code switch terms like that. But code switching is more than just switching terms as well. Like code switching applies to like how you speak, how you dress, how we perform our gender, all sorts of stuff like that. And I definitely, do find myself switching that a bit. And it's tricky because sometimes I wonder, well, which part of this is the authentic me? Like, am I hiding one part of myself from one community and showing it to another, or am I hiding from both? And that becomes distressing when you sort of start to lose a sense of that. I think at the end of the day, like they're both probably authentic expressions of myself, but I'm just trying to be understood by people. And often what I'm trying to do is to be known and understood. And to do that, I've actually got to jump through some hoops to translate my experience or my feelings into the dialect that person understands. And this is where that idea of dual citizenship sort of really comes into the forefront, because I might be trying to describe the same experience of my life and how I'm feeling today to someone at church. And I have to use a whole set of language and terminology and comparisons to be understood, to be really seen for who I am. Then I might go to my workplace and describe to a bunch of colleagues who aren't Christians, and I use totally different language. And it's exhausting in a way, sort of translating your experiences for people, and particularly for people like Christians that might be pretty unaware of the systemic issues facing LGBTIQ plus people, to not just explain how you're feeling right now, but the rich background of why what happened today fits into a bigger narrative of your life and over queer history. And it leads to what I think Dr. Twyla Brown calls translation exhaustion, when you're not just the person who's trying to be understood by someone, but you have somehow found yourself in the role of educator, of actually having to give people the historical background to be understand you right now. And that gets exhausting, which is why I said, emotional fatigue was kind of just a big part of that experience for me.
So you're training, you're a ministry worker, you're somebody who wants to go and proclaim the gospel as your work. And that's always been a really fascinating job to me, because you're being trained in things, so you're learning and you're gaining skills, but it's also got a moral dimension. You're expected to have integrity in your life and to let the things that you are learning and teaching actually transform you, which is kind of very strange if you compare it to something like, I guess like whatever we learn and absorb is going to change us necessarily, but like not in such a moralistic way or overtly value-driven way. And so I presume you put a lot of time into thinking about how the church should change its culture and the way that it includes or talks to or approaches these issues of queer identities, of LGBTQI people, of queer rights, and host of other things. Yeah. So sorry, just to boil this into a question, I was kind of floundering there thinking about how to frame it. What do you think churches should be doing more in the future to better include and respond to LGBTQ people?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's something I've been thinking a lot about this week, particularly actually. I've actually been, over the last few days, drafting a couple of blog posts about a particular thing that I think not just the church generally, but churches specifically need to be doing, and that is rewriting a cultural script for gay people. Now, Mark Yarhouse is a Christian clinical psychologist, and he wrote a book recently about what the church can learn from celibate gay Christians. And one of the things he talks about in chapter 2 of his book is the idea of cultural scripts and what he calls a gay script, that basically, from a young age, when the child realizes that they're gay, it's what does that person aspire to? Like, what does their ideal life look like when they're dreaming of well and up as a 15-year-old kid? What are their hopes and dreams for the future? And what is the community telling that person their life can and should look like? And these cultural scripts, they kind of are not just aspirations, but they also represent a community's ideals, their values. And the thing is that, if you're, a gay kid who just realizes that you're attracted to the same gender, you're given a whole bunch of cultural scripts from the secular world around you. It's, wonderfully easy to access those now in our generation. But I think the church is still woefully behind in giving an alternative gay script. Probably the most that we've come up with so far is don't do that. Don't date that person. Don't sleep around. And most of what we have to say to gay people is just don'ts. And it's what Eve Tushnet calls a vocation of no. That's not a calling. It's not a vocation when all you're being told is no. What does it actually look like to thrive, to flourish as a gay Christian? Because being told not to pursue a relationship is just not enough. And so I think as a culture, we actually need to develop new cultural scripts. And that does need to be a cultural thing. It's why I think individual churches need to do it, because it's not enough for that to be an idea out there that some authors write about, some people speak about, or some individuals have found for themselves. But a cultural script is handed down to us by the community around us. And so I think we need to embody that in the DNA of our communities and our churches enough. That a 15-year-old kid who's just realized he's gay already has this picture of what a flourishing life might look like if he decides to keep following Jesus for the rest of his life.
I think it's a really powerful and encouraging approach to say that, the secular world is also struggling to create different scripts of success and normativity for people who are marginalized, right? Historically, queer people have had higher rates of suicide, depression, murder, and that's not just to lump it all into one category. We can stratify, we can think about the intersection of different facets of identity. We think about trans misogyny and the way that that's been expressed through murder rates and the incredibly saddening aspect of queer youth suicide. So if they're struggling with it too, it's in some ways really interesting to think about what the Christian response is in the same vein of what cultural scripts for success and normativity can we provide. But with a view, a Christological perspective that is looking towards Jesus.
Yeah, totally. And I think a big part of what a cultural scripture does is giving meaning that explains someone's experience. It's not just saying, here's what you've got to do, go do it. This is how you'll find the path to flourishing. That's part of it. But I think a big part of actually experiencing flourishing is having meaning. So in the podcast, This Cultural Moment, Mark Sayers says, we're all meaning-making machines. As humans, that's what we are, as we try to find or create meaning in everything in our experience. And so when the world around us says, this is what it means to be gay, this is why, and this is what you do with that, Christians need to not just say, here's what to do with it. They actually need to explain, what does it mean that you're gay? What does it say about God and the way that he's made you? What does it say about your place in our community? What does it say about the way that you can and should relate to people around you? What does it mean for your picture of success? I think actually giving meaning to those things is really important. And one thing that the church, I think is slowly getting better at, but needs to do more of, is helping gay people to actually find significance in our sexual orientation, not just despite it, but in it. To not just think, I can be known and loved by my church despite the fact that I'm a gay man, but to actually be valued by my community for the unique giftings that I have as a gay man. And I think a really big moment for me in actually deciding to do ministry full time was actually during the plebiscite. I got in touch with my old pastor, and I was kind of just having a bit of a whinge to him about how hard it was, sort of seeing how some Christians were having conversations about this stuff. And he listened sympathetically, but then he took the conversation so I didn't expect. He basically said, "This is actually why I think you should go into ministry, because you're gay and Christian, because as part of that experience, you actually have a pastoral sensitivity and an empathy for people that most ministers don't have. And it's exactly that sort of people that we need leading the church." And that was really big for me, because it wasn't just saying, I think you should go into ministry, but it was saying, here's how I think God's actually uniquely gifted you through your sexuality with what you need to be able to serve people in the Christian community. And that made me realize how little I'd had that actually. It wasn't enough to just try and flourish despite my sexuality. But even as complicated as my experience of sexuality is, to actually see the meaning in it, to see the ways that God is actually powerfully using that to bless other people. I think that gave me a whole new framework for understanding it.
So we've been talking about the ways in which church and church communities should be responding to non-heterosexual attraction and to queer people. Dare I ask the reverse, which is like, what do you hope for queer communities that maybe you're involved in, or like the kind of question of looking outward into the world?
Yeah, that's a great question. Look, to be honest, I don't know that I've actually spent a huge amount of time in a queer community, like whatever that is. I often talk about
not as if there's just one,
queer
right?
community. Yeah. So I obviously am included in the queer population, and I have plenty of queer friends as a musician, particularly as a bassoon player, where almost every male bassoon player is gay for some reason. That's a fact you now know. I have plenty of gay friends, but that doesn't necessarily mean I've spent a lot of time in a community where I've seen those cultural norms in a different way. I've certainly seen them, but maybe not lived them in the same way that I have familiarity with the Christian community. So that's I just want to acknowledge that I don't have all the answers, and I kind of just thinking out loud here. But I think one thing that I have noticed is that the queer community often it has a particular idea of what it is to be queer, and people who don't fit into that often don't really experience the celebration of diversity that the queer community might claim to value. And that's true of not just religious people, and particularly celibate people. It's true of queer people of colour. It's true of people of diverse genders. It's true of a lot of women or non-binary people. So I think we talk about the queer community. Often we sort of think as a cisgender white gay man of a certain age bracket. And so I think we actually need to actually practice what we preach about diversity being valued in the queer community, and include that diversity, spread that to include not just gender and sexuality, but also faith. Actually acknowledging that faith is a huge part of someone's life and a huge part of how they experience their sexuality. That's tricky because I understand that it is hard for someone who's experienced deep trauma on the part of the church, who's a gay person and who's left that behind, to share community with someone who's, a ministry trainee, for example. And so I've been very careful about not inviting myself into queer spaces, not because I don't feel comfortable there, but I don't want other people to feel uncomfortable around someone who's quite religious. I don't want them to feel unloved by me or by other Christians. And, it's hard enough to find those autonomous spaces as it is, but I don't want to take my faith in there. But I often feel like my faith is not welcome there. And that's a tricky thing, because I'm happy to forego that for the sake of living that, feeling a safe space for everyone else. But I also know lots of other gay Christians who are just craving that autonomous space where they can be themselves with both their sexuality and their faith together. And they're feeling that they can't get that quite in the church, and they can't quite get that in the queer space. So I think both the church and the queer community need to actually practice what we preach at, really celebrating diversity.
That's a really great articulation. And it feels like a confluential answer as well, like, representation and celebrating diversity and recognizing people, like the reason why we have been made fun of is actually a type of strength that can be used in society for the good of the church, for the good of people, for the good of society, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, and I think like maybe like tying back to the conversation earlier about code switching, I think that the dark side of that is often we might code switch just to conform, to fit in, to make people feel like we're not that different to them. Sometimes it's not just about being understood and being seen, but yeah, there's a darker part to that, and I think you see this in movies like Love, Simon, where the opening montage is him saying, basically, I'm just like you, I'm not that different, except for this one little thing, and it sort of undermines a lot of what has been good about the queer movement of actually saying we don't have to be like you for you to love us and accept us. Like the fact that we're like you shouldn't make a difference to whether we're accepted. Maybe we're not just like you. Maybe we're totally different. Maybe you don't understand us, but we're human and we have that human dignity, and that should be the basis on which we accept and love each other.
It sounds like you're underscoring that the value of being human is the thing that overrides all of these. Like, we shouldn't look at any other value and say this is how we judge you by, even as they inform the way that we live and see the world.
I think that's something that Christians particularly have to offer, because we believe as Christians that we're made in the image of God, and that is where our humanity and our human dignity and worth come from, is being made by God in His image, and nothing can take that away from us. And no, gender, sexual orientation, ethnic background can ever make you not in the image of God. And so I think we, of all people, need to be really preaching that.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that's why it's so exciting to, I guess, start this conversation thinking very broadly about the issues of identity and people in society. This, I'm overwhelmed with like a little bit of emotion, actually, which is probably why I'm struggling with words, but because I think it is wonderful to have these things articulated and presented with such a I guess like supportive and hopeful voice. I hope that you don't mind if just as a final question, I then take all these things that we've presented as context and zoom out and ask about, like, how did you get to this position where it sounds like you've been thinking through a lot of these issues really carefully, and you're able to present what seems like a very cogent and coherent, argument, whereas I'm sure other people's experiences will be one of contradiction, of double lives, of like difficulty in reconciling what the world at least presents as two very, very different things. Do you have any advice for people who are going through that kind of process of reconciling or like dealing with the tension?
Yeah, I want to say, like, if that's you, like, you're very much in the majority. Like, yeah, certainly people who are grappling with the complexities of sexuality and faith. Yeah, like for many people, it's quite a traumatic or even distressing thing trying to grapple with such a complex thing. And so I really hope that if I have come across as coherent, that's not an off-putting thing, because, like, do you know that there's been decades of grappling with hard questions myself, and of grieving difficult things to come to this point. I think I would say one thing that's really helped me has been to just identify, what do I really know for certain? What is that one thing that I know beyond a shadow of doubt? And having that as a really firm foundation, and then just building onto that bit by bit. It's not like you just suddenly have this framework where everything makes sense. But I remember, like, as a kid, and this is back before I really knew that much about God or about the Bible. And my dad used to make us read the Bible every night, which I look back and I'm grateful for, but I didn't enjoy at the time. And I remember reading Luke chapter 15 every night, because I thought the rest of the Bible was kind of boring, to be honest. I was maybe 5 or 6. I was pretty young. But I'd read Luke chapter 15 every night. And I just found this idea of the shepherd who would go out and seek that lost sheep, to leave the 99 behind, to go seeking for that one lost sheep, because he cared for that particular sheep so much. That picture of God who would give up anything to seek that one lost sheep, and then all the angels in heaven rejoicing when that lost sheep is found. That was just such an important picture of God's character to me as a kid that has always stuck with me. And I think for me, that's been the foundation of knowing what God is like, knowing God is a good and a loving God that will go to any lengths to bring someone home. That was the foundation. So on top of that, I've been understanding more about God and more about what he says about sexuality, more about how I understand my own experiences through the lens of that as my foundation.
Matthew, I think that is a beautiful summary of what we've talked about. I really appreciate you coming to chat with me about sexuality, faith, music, all of these things. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks so much for having me, Shanglin.
Great pleasure. See you soon. Bye.
See ya.
If you want to read more of Matthew's writing, you should definitely check out singledout.blog, where Matthew writes about the intersection of faith and sexuality with great nuance and raw emotion. And I found it very affecting. So do check out the writing there. And you are watching/listening to The Distillery, a series of casual online interviews. You can check out the previous episodes on distillery.site and also check out our future guests. And you can also follow us on Instagram at distillery.site and Twitter at distillery site. We have new episodes every day, so do check back. Thanks, everyone, and take care.